Welcome to Corona Time. This is episode 10, big milestone. It's who would have thought that 10 weeks ago we would have started this. So I just wanted to, before we get into the film of this week, just wanted to give ourselves a pat on the back that takes commitment and effort to keep watching movies and to, actually show up in podcasts. It's, we're both busy, individuals. And, when we start, I thought it was going to be a quick, 45 minutes, but I think our conversations end up becoming long and we have good, meaningful discussions. So I just wanted to, mark the occasion. This week's film is a film that's actually close to my heart because it's partly influenced my youth and my teenage years. It's called Ghost in the Shell. It's directed by Mamoru Oshii. It's actually based on a manga by Matsume Shiro, I believe his name is. And I'll give a little backdrop. Is you're kind of injected into a futuristic Japan, where think of classic cyberpunk. You're injected into a 2050 or 2050-01 type of or 2500-01 type of world, and technology's advanced, and there's cyborgs, and there's rapid technology and stuff. And you're just and what's interesting about this film is that normally this is a hard part with sci-fi in general or cyberpunk specifically, is that you're kind of always injected into the world. So I think of often The Matrix, or actually The Matrix probably did a good job introducing, but I'm thinking of Blade Runner and some other films where you're trying to learn about the world initially in your first half an hour viewing of a film, because you have to learn all their lingo, language, and nuance. But the film centers around one particular major character named the Major. I believe her full name is Makoto Kusanagi. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I'd like to get your initial thoughts on the film, because I think with this anime, right, it's an anime film. I forgot to mention that. But that normally we talk about directing style and stuff, and with anime films, because a lot of it is drawn, the backgrounds are drawn often first, actually, before the actual motion animation. So it's even a different filmmaking process. But I know that I've talked about this film for many years, so I'm curious about as somebody who's watched it first timer, what you thought about the film, and some of the, even though it's a short film, if you think about it, it's only 90 minutes. What did you think of the I think some of the deeper themes of the movie? There's some dialogue in there that stood up. I probably ripped off and mentioned. So.
Yeah. So before I sort of give my initial thoughts on the film, since this is an anime, you don't quite have that typical directing style like you do with a live action type of movie. But one thing that I found interesting this was more some tidbits of information that I found while researching this film after I watched it, was that apparently with Oshii, in order to try to get some inspiration for certain scenes within the film, he actually took the entire crew over to Guam. I don't know if you know this, and they actually started firing rounds of ammunition at different objects to see, what would be the trajectories of these objects and some of the effects. So if you notice in one of the scenes later in the film, when the bullets are firing in the wall, there are no sparks. And this was included because when you actually fire at stone, the bullets don't generate any sparks. So he had those little levels of detail included in the film, which I found pretty interesting and cool, because you still try to keep it, even though it's an animation, you try to keep some of those details real and relevant within the film itself. So sorry for that little tangent. Just thought I'd sort of plug that in there because I found that a little interesting. But in terms of my overall sort of feelings of the film, I mean, it was very good. You could see that this, within the 90s, especially with the anime, there was definitely a lot of sort of cyberpunk inspired animes were definitely very prevalent during that time period, and Ghost in the Shell is definitely no different. There were a lot of sort of elements that I've seen in, or themes that I've seen in other sort of cyberpunk animes, specifically Evangelion, that were sort of brought out. A lot of them have to deal with sort of the identity of the self, because I know at many times throughout the film, Kusanagi, the main character, is sort of questioning, well, am I really human? Am I a cyborg? Because she's essentially within the film, over time, she's had many of her appendages and parts of her body sort of replaced over and over. And so the idea is, at what point are you still human? Are you still like the original thing that you were, or are you something else? And so that's something that was pretty interesting because she questions if she's human many times in the film, whereas her partner really does not. He sort of acts as that contrast throughout the film. So I thought that sort of differentiation between the two characters was pretty interesting in the development of the storyline.
Yeah, I mean, to speak of like the animation itself, I mean, I've actually seen other Oshi's films, and they're all highly recommended. Um, but the one thing I will definitely speak to is that like you can see in this era of like still the 1990s that like most of the stuff was still like I mean, I watch more anime. Disclosure, I watch a lot more anime than my partner here. So before the computer revolution came with like the digitization, a lot of the stuff was. I mean, even in the 90s, they did enhance a little bit with the computers, but you can still tell that a lot of the finer details were hand drawn. Especially if you watch, maybe later, like down the line, I'll pick a more, let's say, modern anime film. You'll notice immediately like the difference because this is right before that computer revolution happened in the anime industry, which some people they have no problems with. Others over idealize maybe the 80s and 90s, but yeah, in that sense, I guess that's a fair analysis of like the animation style, because obviously anime, even though it's a movie, if you watch something from the 80s or early 90s, and you compare it to a movie of like today's standards, you'll see there's definitely a stylistic difference. And one of the reasons is because of like how they're made now and the computer aspect of enhancement.
Right.
When it comes to cyberpunk, yeah, I agree that like this is definitely, especially in the 90s, a time where people were definitely, there was this. I mean, we grew up in this era, so it's hard to like talk as if we were adults then. But what I've read often, like watching documentaries and stuff, is that a lot of people had there was a lot of unknown in the 90s about the internet and like what technology could bring, right? This is before Web 2.0, which is like YouTube, Facebook. This is where like people were like freaking out about Y2K, in the 1999. So there was a lot of euphoria around the possibilities of the net and the culture it could bring, right? There was this libertarian idealism of like the 1990s internet that you could say now in 2020 maybe was a bit naive, but I think cyberpunk is like, when you look at the 80s and 90s, is like a specific genre that's, they're just, in my opinion, having read a lot, a decent amount, kind of like envisioning a future. Well, one is actually criticizing capitalism, which I don't want to get into right now. But the second aspect is also kind of like envisioning a future where like, yeah, like our identity, like what does it mean to be a connected individual, right? What does it mean to be a web user? What is the future of AI and cybernetics and all that stuff, which, we haven't had full-blown cyborgs yet, but I think that really piqued the imagination of that period. And yeah, like and what's interesting about this movie, not only is it short, there's also, there's also gaps where like you have scenes where there's no dialogue, right? You're just, you're just watching the major. I'm gonna just use a major. It's easier to say that than her full name. Just in her bed or just like observing the world. I was gonna say, what do you think of like that futuristic Japan? But before I get to answer that question, and then there's also like scenes where like it's like you said, like with Bateau and the major having like really precise dialogue about identity, what's am I real, what's fake. And then even when we get to the puppet master later, like that whole conversation, there's like high level dialogue and then it like drops to like, basically sometimes there's just space in between. But yeah, I'm curious what you thought of the setting and like the world. This is like our first cyberpunk film, so.
Yeah, it is. It's a first film that we've sort of actually reviewed on this podcast, although we've talked about other sort of anime series that deal with cyberpunk prior to actually starting this podcast. But I like the way that Oshii sort of crafted this world. There's apparently quite a bit of debate as to whether or not this was actually supposed to be a futuristic type of Japan, because some people actually have noted that some of the streets and way that this sort of city is structured is actually more resembles Hong Kong more strongly. And apparently even the beer that they drink is a popular Philippines beer that is actually it's actually very popular within Hong Kong itself. So I guess a little bit of controversy as to whether this city is supposed to mirror that of Tokyo or Hong Kong in the future. I thought the way that the animation was done was just, great. I can't really criticize anything. It's very visually appeasing to me. I sort of like the style with which Oshii sort of crafted this universe. There's nothing I could really criticize other than I just found it interesting because there were so many scenes within this film that were so reminiscent of The Matrix, where you can totally see that this was definitely a huge inspiration for the making of that film.
Yeah,
I know this came out like 3-4 years.
When you especially see the plugging in, you're like, wow, that's cute. That's a rip off.
The plug for one, even the initial scene, or one of the initial scenes where they're chasing who they think is a puppet master at that time through the market square. It's very reminiscent of another chase scene at the end of The Matrix. There were so many parallels where I was like, wow, okay. And I really like The Matrix, but I was like, it's kind of a ripoff of this movie in many ways, even with the themes. But overall, yeah, visually I can't complain about anything that was sort of done within this film.
So, not to go off too much in a tangent, but like the whole like debate about if it's futuristic or not, that's actually interesting because I think I've normalized that sometimes in anime specifically, because I see this a lot, like especially in the fantasy genre, where like it's supposed to be like fake, but then they're like going to high school. So I think it's part of that, like that medium where, for some of the smaller details, they do plug in like everyday things that we know, like a beer type or whatever. Mm-hmm. So I could see how like a purist when it comes to science fiction and cyberpunk would say like it's probably in the gray area, because a pure cyberpunk is like Blade Runner, where it's 100% kind of like very futuristic, and like you don't even recognize like the government of the world or any of the structures, except for when like if it's a film kind of criticizing maybe some modern day structures, but or like political systems or corporations. But yeah, I think the animation is great. I think what's interesting is that I will say this on a personal note, that like my second time, or it's my third time viewing it, it didn't have the same impact I've noticed that like when I first saw this film when I was like 13. I remember when I was 13, I was just blown away. I was just like, wow, this is like, this is part of my philosophy now. But the third time viewing it, I enjoyed it, but I didn't get the same kick that I did obviously the first or even second time. And I've watched the series standalone complex, and I think I even watched the sequel to this film too. So I just didn't get the same kick. But one thing I do remember, that the Puppet Master conversation, that was one that still to this day, it still is one that I could probably watch it over and over again. So.
Which conversation are you specifically?
Actually, both. Like, there's the one at the end, but there's also the one where he's in captivity, and he says he's a sentient being. Obviously, the one at the end I was referring to, but I forgot that one was also really good too, when he's captured and he's talking to like his captors. Puppet Master is like it's him and the Laughing Man. Laughing Man's in the series, but those are like my two favorite like kind of like villain supposedly, but Puppet Master is like great. But yeah, what's interesting is that like there's other characters too, like the chief and like the other partners. And then there's even some hints of like government corruption, Section 5, Section 9, in that world, which is expanded.
Section 6.
Yeah, Section 6, which is expanded further in the TV series, but so you only get a taste of it in the movie. But because I think the movie is really about like those themes of identity, AI. What is the future of humanity if we merge with AI? I mean, there's also a lot of symbolism. Like there's the whole Tree of Life reference in the towards the end of the movie, and obviously the conversations about merging identity and how even the Puppet Master wanted to die. Right? He understood that for there to be life, there needs to be death, which is something that I think a lot of the Silicon Valley people who are obsessed about immortality are kind of forgetting. But we can get into that later. I was gonna ask, like, what did you think of like the other character, Bateau? Like, he's kind of like the counterpoint, even though he's friends with the Major and like they have a good relationship. He seems to be more like a practical guy than like the major who is like having all these like existential questions, and is very actually she's the one that's obsessed about meeting the puppet master stuff, which is something that's kind of like injected into the story because it's not fully fleshed out like why she's like very drawn. But maybe that's what's part of the beauty of the film, is that like even the puppet master says that like he is drawn to her.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious about like some of the other characters. What do you think of like on the side?
Well, I think I brought this up before that Batao is. His character sort of serves as a contrast to Kusanagi, where, like I mentioned this earlier, that she's very, she sort of questions herself because she's pretty much like a cyborg, where she's had so many things done to her and enhanced her cybernetically, that it's like, at what point do you stop becoming like the human? It's like, I saw someone make this comparison. It's like if you have a hammer and a hatchet, and you burn through, or like you use it repeatedly to the point where you damage the head of the hammer or the hatchet, and then replace it, and then you destroy the handle, and you do that for multiple iterations, it's still the original hammer, right? And that's kind of like the sort of idea with this. It's like, am I still really human because I've had all these modifications done to me? So those are some of the existential questions where she asks herself internally and sort of expresses those aloud to Batao. Batao is just like, what are you talking about? You're human. Stop it with all this. And you can see sort of that big contrast where she doesn't really. It's really interesting in many scenes because there are several scenes where she's nude or appears to be like nude, and Batao looks away. Right? I don't know if you remember that or not.
Yeah.
And really, sort of the comparison that I found interesting is that it's borderline like. What came to mind because Batao, like, he is almost like sort of comes to the realization, like, I need to get rid of the privacy. It kind of reminds me of like the Adam and Eve story. I know I've mentioned this before on several other podcasts that we've done because they've sort of brought up these themes before, where it's like, when you take the bite of the apple from the tree of knowledge, then you sort of realize, oh, I'm naked. It's almost like Batao sort of realizes that, or he has it ingrained in his mind that he's human and that you're just not supposed to do that. Whereas at her point, it's like, well, I'm not sure if I'm human or not, so the idea of just being nude or any nudity doesn't really faze me. That was something that I found kind of interesting. I don't know if they were trying to go in that direction or not, but I do know in several other cyberpunk like series that I've seen, specifically with like Evangelion, they tend to draw from some Christian themes that they introduce through the medium.
Yeah, I think you're right on the contrast of like worldviews, is because I think they both understand that like they're both cybernetics and they both have their bodies augmented and replaced over and over again. So like one is saying like, oh, that's just part of the world we live in, and like as long as my ghost, and we can always talk about what that means, is like intact, then I am who I am, no matter if I'm switching bodies. While like the major is kind of like you said, Kusanagi is like, she's starting to have these existential doubts of like if that's really the case, am I my body, or am I this ghost, or am I both, or like
what am I?
Yeah, which is why I think she's so drawn to the puppet master, because he's also having similar questions to himself. But like you said, Batao is like, to him, it's very black and white, where it's like, yeah, you can swap my body out 1,000 times as long as my ghost is intact. I am who I am.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. So I'm just curious, did you see that sort of Adam and Eve comparison when you were watching this film?
Not really. I saw it more through like my what I said earlier, that like he actually does think that like the body is something that like once you're in, it's yours. Well, I think, like you said, Kusanagi thinks that like my body is like whatever. Like apparently I can get a new one in the factory like tomorrow. Like you said, it comes to the clothes too. Like Kusanagi is very willy-nilly to throw her clothes whenever, right? But you notice that like Batao actually likes like having a look in like a certain aesthetic. He doesn't just view his body as like a
well, and then whenever she's new too, he like tends to like clothe her.
Exactly, yeah. So I your interpretation is actually like interesting. I think it's valid too, because I think he's a little more aware of like, I think like just the physical than like the traditional maybe point of view. While like Kusanagi's, I think she is, the whole movie really, she's trying to like rediscover herself, but also what's the next step, which is we'll get to that ending eventually. But
the only reason I sort of made that comparison within that sort of sequence of how they view their bodies is because Batao, he like doesn't question that he's human or not, whereas Kusanagi does. And it's kind of like, oh, well, when you got the tree of knowledge, or when you realize you're human, you sort of realize that you're naked. And so that's what really sort of came to mind. There's two different viewpoints and outlooks, and then how they react to, seeing the physical flesh, if you will.
So I want to talk about a specific scene because this was famous in anime history, I guess, lore. The one that it's the one they're chasing the technicians, and she fights the guy in the like she's invisible, but she fights the guy in the there's they're like in this river or this pond. I don't know what it was, but it's like there's the water fight. The water fight. I'll call it the water fight. I know that the Americanized version of the film, which I didn't watch, for full disclosure, because I refused to watch that. They reenacted that scene too, because it's a very famous like fight sequence, and actually, yeah, because of the history of anime. I'm curious what you thought of that scene, because I actually rewatching that as one of the scenes I was like, oh, this is actually still as awesome as I remember. So,
it was cool because the setup, like, you can tell. I forgot what the character's name that was being chased, but I guess you referred to him as a technician, because I think he's like the puppet master. He's controlled by the puppet master. Because there was a lot of lead up, and he was fighting off forces. Then he gets to that point in the river, so you think he's like free and clear. So there's like some point of like I guess relief you kind of see in his face, and then he quickly realizes that he is not alone. I mean, as terms of fight sequences, yeah, it was pretty epic, and you could see sort of visually sort of the backdrop of the buildings behind them, and then just being in the water riverway. Yeah, it was just a cool sort of landscape that they chose to craft that fight scene in. I mean, that was my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I forgot that, like, to me, like, I'm gonna, like I said, I've watched an okay amount of anime, but I just forgot how fluid that scene was. So, like, some of those animations were like, I've noticed that animation that when you notice a character like moving fluidly, it's actually very hard to do that. Because it just seems so like, seamless.
I guess I haven't watched enough anime to see fight scenes that are really disjointed. But yeah, I guess I didn't pay super close enough attention. But yeah, it seemed very fluid to me.
Yeah, and then with the water, right? Like when they're taking steps, and it's just like the sound. Like it's actually, I forgot like how like iconic it really was. It is, and I actually, because it's so animated so well, I always thought from the get go the live action version of the film was always gonna have a problem because it's hard to recreate that. But anyways,
it really does help when you have like a $10 million budget for this animation film.
Trust me, there's bigger budgets out there. Actually,
I feel like that was a pretty big budget though.
But what's funny is that I bet you like live action films are always like major budgets, because unfortunately they never pay animators enough. But
it's a different aesthetic, a different feel watching an animation versus a live action.
That's true. I think what's interesting is that this movie is probably the one that's reached the most global reach Oshii's films. But actually, now that and I like this movie, but I've watched his other works too, and honestly, this is probably not his best work. And it's like you're thinking like, wow, this guy's a legend then, because this is actually not that bad. There's other films where like, he takes even deeper dives into. I think.
So, what would you consider a better work of his?
I think Jinro is probably. I think all the movies where he's tackling Japan. Issues of Japan, because he's actually admitted that like there's some movies that he's made that he actually said that he doesn't think Americans are going to understand, and I found that always interesting because it means that he's trying to tackle the modern Japan under the American order, which is something that like we're Americans, so like we have a hard time sometimes, I think, putting our minds there because we grew up in the superpower. Versus like, okay, you grew up in Japan in the the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and you're used to the post World War II Japan, right? With the new constitution and also under the American empire, I'm gonna say American influence. And I know that he has talked like he's made movies about like what does it mean to be in that realm where like how can you have a military that doesn't actually has the rules that say they can't fire unless fired upon, like because we did that, to defang them like we did with Germany. But maybe that could be table for another time. But I do, if everybody's interested in like his works, I do recommend like exploring his other movies and other like not live action. Personally, I haven't seen his live action work, and I hear that it's not as good as his anime work. But I encourage everyone to explore his other like films because they do explore like I think being Japanese and especially in the 80s and 90s. So but Ghost in the Shell, I think I think why it did so well, even with like I said, the influence of the Matrix, is because there's a lot of messages in there that's not specific to being Japanese or and I think it's a very universal film about, like I said, technology, identity, futurism. And I think that's why like it probably had a wider appeal, and why it had a sequel, and probably why there was even a live action version of it, because I think this movie is that kind of transcendence. While like I said, his other works might be very, I mean, he's admitted, like you might have to understand like art history a little bit to like get the movie, which happens often with some films, right? Like you watch maybe some films about a specific piece of history or culture, unless you're like kind of read about it or know about it, like you're not gonna get it, Like I could understand like people like trying to learn about like, maybe like how the border is in America between U.S. and Mexico, and their only frame of reference is that they have a border with Poland, and it's not the same, right?
Well, I'll give since we've already reviewed this film, I mean, The Mission is sort of a perfect example where it's like if you're not super familiar with the Catholic Church and their dealings in South America, it's going to be harder to sort of relate to.
Yeah, that's actually a great example. So, but yeah, this, I mean, this is a film that like I look back and it's one of my, I definitely, it was like Evangelion. I watched it and I remember thinking like my life is never going to be the same. Yeah, in general, like I'm curious about like what do you like in this time period, especially like I said, going back to the 90s, in this internet.com boom bubble thing. What's also interesting about this movie is that like it's also captures a little bit of what was happening in Japan, where the Japanese banking crisis was hitting hard in the 90s, right? And they would have this basically 20-year, maybe it's still ongoing, deflationary cycle
period
of like no GDP growth really, and I guess with Oshii, I think he tries to capture like, okay, like things are continuing, but like, are we making any real progress? Which is why I think there was a little message there about like, you have to evolve. You can't just, things have to change. Because if for listeners who aren't aware with maybe some of the nuances of Japanese culture, that banking crisis really affected a generation because the economic growth slowed. Birth rates, it's well documented, is dropped like a rock. And then you also see a little bit of a little bit of nihilism set into the society where, a lot of youth, they feel totally disillusioned with, the economic structure, the political structure, and also like how things are going. And I think, like I said, I think it's reflected with the marriage and birth rates, even though you can always say that's mostly economic, but also the culture is like, in many ways maybe hasn't evolved. And I just wonder sometimes if Oshii is trying to like challenge people, saying like, our own culture needs to evolve. We know that the Japanese are very hard on immigrants and migrants. They're very ethnocentric. We have a friend that admires that about them. But it's very intriguing how like anime in many ways, and I think there are live action movies too, but anime also, I'm gonna just specifically talk about anime, that they try to sometimes explore, because it's interesting how like you read about Japanese culture or you read old stories of like American businessmen of like, oh, they're so proper, they're always apologize, they show no emotion, and then you watch some anime films and you're like, wow, there's a lot of human emotion, like they're just not showing it to us, like it's interesting like cultures and like how we're all human really, right? Like they still feel like anxiety, stress, fear, hope, love, right? It's just you know, they just might not show you because it's their culture, like to not even bother you on the train if you sneeze. You know, they actually feel guilty if you sneeze on the train. Actually.
So
but anyways, I'll let you go right now. So go ahead.
Just real quick, one trend. I don't know if you've heard that here in America that certain cities I've heard there's been sort of a trend to have sort of they're like professional cuddlers where you can go and sort of pay people to go and like cuddle with you, which I don't know what that says about our society exactly, but over in Japan, they actually have this sort of phenomenon within Tokyo, at least that I've seen, nothing on Vice, where it's called like the sort of boyfriend experience, in that they will pay some guy to just be like sort of, you know, try to get the emotions out of them. So he'll like play this guy who's like this boyfriend will basically go to, and they'll hire them at like corporate offices or whatever, and they'll rent a conference room, and he'll just play like a video clip of things that are terribly sad, right? And so you'll see like all these women crying in the room, and he's just sort of there to comfort them. And it's just interesting because if you hear like these women or what they're saying, he's like, you know, we're sort of taught to be sort of like emotionally repressed in our society to an extent, and so that it just feels like therapeutic to, you know, like cry and sort of be comforted in that way. And so I think that's, yeah, within anime they get a lot of emotion out of you, at least within quite a few animes that I've seen, whereas I don't think that is necessarily reflected in their society at all times. And that's just going to indicate, I think that's just going to indicate by the trend that you would hire somebody to be, you know, sort of compassionate towards you and try to encourage you to cry. Like, that's just a very interesting trend that I think most people would find.
Yeah, and like it's a very structured society, because it's also well documented that, especially in Korea and other countries, but in Japan is in that group where the suicide rate is actually very high. And there's actually documentaries about the suicides and how actually people do it by going to some forest and hanging themselves. And it's often when they look into the reasons, I actually saw this documentary, when they look into the reasons why people are doing this, it's often like, oh, I didn't get married, I didn't get the marriage I wanted, or I'm not moving up in the company, or I went to school, I was studying to get into the entrance exam and I didn't make it, you know, because it's like, you know, we get like in college we get acceptance letters, but like in Japan, like they actually have to, like, I think now it's online, but traditionally the visual way to think of it is like we all look at these like long charts and they see if they're on the list of acceptance or not, you know. And
sort of like rankings wise, right? I've seen that happen with like certain, I think SAT code, or maybe not SATs, but certain codes. I think even in like shows in the 90s, like Boy Meets World, where you'd have your scores posted, you know, like an ID code, and basically it'll tell you your score.
Exactly. Like you have an ID code. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Same concept. And, you know, because I think people forget that like Japan was China before China. Like there was this huge economic boom in like the 70s and 80s. And if you read a lot of like the New York Times, like old, like 40 years ago now or 50 years ago, you know, there was this paranoia that like, oh, Japan's gonna like, you know, be the again
take
like,
over
what it once, like what it tried to do in the, you know, the 30s and 40s. But that bubble popped, and then, you know, the demographic thing happened. And it's interesting how in today nobody talks like that. Nobody says, oh, Japan is like, you know, the rising power, you know. So it's interesting how like in just like a generation the conversation shifted. And I just want to that's why I just want to highlight that Asian banking crisis was pretty big. You know, it was a huge deal over there. So.
Well, it's huge, and then you, like you said, you couple that with low birth rates and all that, and the fact that they are a very anti-immigrant society that just is like a cauldron for like a lot of sort of economic depression. That's just
exactly. Yeah. And actually, well, yeah, I agree. And then what's interesting is that like because of those circumstances, they're like really advanced in robotics and like and because they need those robotics to take care of. They're betting on it to take care of the elderly.
Yeah.
Because they're not going to accept more people. So
yeah.
So even that science fiction aspect. Sorry to cut you off. Even that science fiction aspect, you see that like even their minds of like imagining the future is definitely, I think, in many ways somewhat advanced, even to like I would say an American, European science fiction scene. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that the only group that they have somewhat of a connection with is like Brazil, and even then they don't really accept many Brazilians into Japan.
Yeah, and it's a huge fiasco. I mean, with the Philippines, because the Philippines actually provide a lot of nurses that they need for healthcare workers, and these Filipinos are like asking like, well, what's our path to citizenship, right? And you know,
They're
most
like, there is
countries,
none. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, pretty much. But yeah, I was gonna you got to my point quicker. But yeah, it's like, you know, in most countries there's like, you know, it's maybe a long process, but like, you know, it's you do this, this, and this, you get there. And Japan's kind of like, you could be here 50 years, we'll never accept you. There's actually in the power of language, I think there's actually a term. I don't know Japanese, so I don't want to say it, but there's actually a term for foreigners that they have specifically to categorize.
I know what you're talking about, because we actually had an English teacher in high school who went to Japan, and he lived there for I think a year or two, and he said that they always referred to him as this word in Japanese that was for foreigner, but it was kind of like a derogatory word.
Yeah, and like I know that when tourists do go, you know, they know you're a tourist, so that they just laugh it off. But they have so many customs around like how you eat and like what's the proper conduct with your boss and with your peers. That like obviously when tourists come, they don't follow any of these norms, because like even if you knew them, it's hard to like, you know, be trained in the culture to do it. So what's interesting is I've read stories of like, you know, because Japanese usually assume you don't know Japanese. They just start, like you said, like making little snide jokes about like, oh, look at the foreigners, they don't like, they eat like barbarians a little bit. And like you said, like the term foreigner in Japan actually is derogatory, because like it is a very, like I said, ethnocentric culture, a very fascinating culture, which I actually personally have learned a lot from. But but it is a stark contrast. And I know that a lot of businessmen who have done a lot of trade deals, when you read their blogs or books, they always mention how like it's, you know, it's very different, and like, you know it's they actually find it like I'm like a bit weird sometimes, because it's like, oh, I want to go home, but if my boss doesn't go home, he wants to go for drinks. It's impolite for me to not go drinks with him, because he shouldn't be drinking alone. It's like, what? You know, like a normal, like even if I was like in marketing or something, I'd be like, no, I want to go home. You know, like I don't have to go drink with you. You know?
Well, yeah, I think here's the stark contrast where it's like it's all within their society, especially, I don't know if it's still today, but historically speaking, a lot of it was very sort of etiquette based on like you're supposed to do all these things, and it's like if you don't do them, you're just incredibly rude and you're sort of outcasted, right? If you don't follow along with what are the accepted norms and structures. Whereas here in the U.S., like you were giving the example, it was like, oh, well, you have to be polite and go drink with your boss. Here, it's like more of an individualistic sort of idea where you do what you want. It was a big, like, here, like, I'll give a contrast, like, I went to China like a year and a half ago now, and it was very interesting seeing the stark contrast between Chinese culture and American culture. Whereas, like, here we view privacy, like, incredibly sort of paramount. In China, it's not really as big of an important issue to them within most Chinese citizens. I think it's the same thing over there, where theirs is very etiquette based. You're supposed to do things proper. Here, it's all about really what you want to do.
Yeah, and I'm gonna use I've been watching a Korean detective show, and like I said, Korea and Japan are separate cultures. I do want to emphasize that, but I think where there's a little overlap is like there was this one scene that actually I watched it, so I'll describe the scene, but I'm gonna describe my reaction first. I watched it thinking like, well, I know this happens in these like societies, but like, you know, you don't see this in like, you know, NCIS or like Law and Order, and you're like, what the heck? So I guess in Korea they're called prosecutors, but like the DA, he did like a subordinate, like he defied his boss's orders. You know, that's the context. And you know how like in Japan too, that they do this too, like you're supposed to apologize if like you do something wrong, like, oh, I'm sorry, right? They like over apologize. So he over apologized, right? And his boss goes, that's not enough. You have to write it in written form. And then there's a scene, it's him writing it. I'm like, wow, I would never see that in like writing it live, like, you know, just and it's like, it reminds me that like, yeah, like this is something that like I have never seen in our own culture. And yeah,
definitely not.
And you know, I think what they're showing is that like this is like the highest form of apology, of like you're gonna take a pen and you're gonna write the whole page out, you know. And he didn't know. And at first, you know, my reaction was like, oh, he's gonna stop him eventually. No, he just lets him finish. You know, I'm like, damn.
It's kind of like how a teacher treats their like students when they're in detention.
Yeah, when you're
I will like on the chalkboard.
Yeah.
I will not do this again.
Yeah.
Although you would never see an adult telling another adult to do that today.
Yeah, but it's you know, I because again maybe I've normalized it too much, but like they do tend to over apologize for like you know, and they also not react. Like when they're being scolded, they'll just say I'm sorry and like you're right and like just not like, the bow and nod the head. You know, they do a lot of the over bowing. In anime, that's exaggerated. Where like not in Ghost in the Shell, but in other shows, we see a lot of like bowing, like as a sort of like ultimate apologies. But when I was watching this live action detective shit series, that was actually very good. You know, I've seen a lot more bowing in this show than I've ever seen in like when I watch like you know, True Detective, right? Anything like that. So, but it's always interesting to see these kind of like contrasts because, you know, you realize that we're all, you know, human, but you also realize that there is like cultures do play a factor in how, you know, people view the world and how people interact with the people around them, you know.
Right.
But yeah, I think we deviate a little bit, but like
very much so. We went on a tangent. Anyway, we gotta just bring it back to the film.
Yeah. So the Puppet Master, because this is a big topic of the movie. I think probably the main actually probably as much as the major is like maybe it's funny how like there's the Bateau and Kusanagi, but really in my opinion it's like the major and Puppet Master. Like those are the two like central characters, and their dialogues are the most like profound. We'll go to the first one where the Puppet Master is like captured, and he's you know, he has this monologue about, you know, I'm a sentient being. I'm curious about like when you saw that for the first time, like, you know, what did you know, what clicked? What did you like? What were your initial feelings and thoughts on that?
I mean, it was just interesting because they got into a lot of sort of philosophical discussion within his monologue. Because, you know, he's essentially what, I don't know if I got this wrong or not, but I view the Puppet Master as he was some sort of, you know, code, some project that was written in collaboration. You know, there's a big conflict or conspiracy there where it was like, oh, an American firm collaborating with Japanese, you know, programmers. And so they made this project. Was it 2051 or something? I can't remember if that's the exact one.
It's like 2501.
2501. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting that wrong. But for Project 2501, where they were essentially trying to, you know, make this sort of AI life form that could essentially act as spies, if you will, for, correct me if I'm screwing up any of this. I was trying to connect the points, but I got lost during certain points, where he was trying to use this to sort of hack into other ghosts to try to act as sort of spies for the Japanese government, if you will, or something along those lines. But at a certain point, they kind of realized that whoever were the creators of Project 2501, they really couldn't control the Puppet Master, which is what he turned into, some sort of AI. And so it was interesting at the point where they realized that they have them, and they were like, you don't really exist. And he's like, how can you prove that? How can you prove that you exist? He's like, you can't really tell me that I don't, because your modern science nor your like philosophy can't even claim as to know, sort of explain what life is, if you will. And so those sort of existential questions and deeper thoughts were really interesting monologues that the Puppet Master sort of brought out, and just some of the better parts of the film, for sure. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up ghost hacking, because I think that, if you remember that scene where they captured the guy that was talking about his wife, and the wife never existed, I don't think they have like a philosophical conversation, but what's interesting is that scene, that whole sequence of him realizing that the wife is fake, all these stories were fake, and he just got ghost hacked, as you mentioned earlier. That really puts a knife into Bateau's argument about like, oh, as long as my ghost is intact, I am who I am, right? Because that was, like you said, there was no dialogue, but that scene is powerful because it shows that like, okay, if your memories are manipulated, are you really who you are then? Right? He was convinced he had a wife and he had like a kid, and no, they told him like, you're living alone, dude, and it's all made up. Dude, look at the picture.
You've never been married.
Yeah, look at the picture, dude. The picture's you. And that whole ghost hacking thing, I think it was, like you said, I think the Puppet Master was probably exploring these ideas himself, because like you said, like he was pushing the questions back on the humans that like, you know, you say, you know, you are, I'm fake, you're real, but like, you know, with the ghost hacking, if you say you're real because you think, or because you have these memories and your identity, I can manipulate that, and like that's then are you you, or are you just a different version of you? Like what? Like you start, like I said, start going like existential route, right? But I think that ghost hacking scene was, I forgot that that's the other scene that's very powerful, where it's like it reminds you that like, yeah, like if my memories were manipulated, and you know how memory, like even in court, right? It's not a sure thing, right? Because you remember things differently, right? So like even my current memories, what if they're not 100% what's based in reality, but I based my identity on these memories, you know, because they're so long ago, right? So that also puts into question about like, if you are, you know, your identity is formed by all the experiences and memories you built up to a certain point. If you start misremembering things that didn't happen, or they didn't happen the way you thought, or they've been, or let's say that with the ghost hacking, they've been altered, then your identity is actually something that's very fluid, which is something that I think is interesting, because I think that's being explored in today's academia around like your identity and your gender being very fluid depending on like circumstance, economics, culture, and also, you know, memory, and also, you know, chemistry, and you know, in the brain and stuff. So I think like this whole genre was a bit ahead of its time, because I think a lot of people are, you know, asking the same questions in a different way in today's environment.
It's very much the case. I would just, I guess, like to add on to that. You can even see that through the personality of Major Kusanagi, whereas she seems fairly like, she's not concerned with when she's naked in many scenes in the film, and from what it appears is she's a pretty asexual type of person, and so in many ways it seems like her sort of character and her personality are very fluid as well. And so I think they were trying to sort of probe ideas of like sort of more like gender or sexual fluidity as well, through her character and through the film itself. And yeah, this is way ahead of its time, because these was made in 99, 95. And, you know, these are a lot of topics that are sort of coming more to the forefront, even in today's society here in the U.S.
Yeah. Yeah, because I totally forgot the ghost hacking. I forgot how great that scene is too, where he's just like in shock that like, what do you mean? I have a daughter, I have a wife, I'm doing all this for them, and it's like, no, you don't. And that's actually a big like reveal twist, and because you know you're only introduced to the character when he's talking about them as if they're real, right? Like it's so believable, right? That like these are conversations you've heard like in your own life, or like, oh yeah, like this person has a great family, and you know he thinks his wife is cheating or whatever, but really it's all manipulated, and it makes you wonder like what identity, memory, all these things, like, you know, it can it's almost like Inception. I'm citing another movie, but like it just reminds me of that context of like, what is dream, what is real, you know, if your identity is based off your memories. Is it dream, and is it,
yeah, like, can you manipulate those?
Yeah,
that was another big
thing. Exactly. And so this leads to the second segue of like the final monologue of the puppet master around life evolution, and his yearning for death, which I think is like profound in itself. I'll let you take the floor on that one. But
yeah, so that last scene was interesting and pretty powerful in that, you know, the puppet master wants to fuse with Major Kusanagi to sort of become one. In many ways, and I know I've already mentioned this earlier in the podcast, or making this comparison, but within the series, the animated series, Evangelion, I mean, sorry if I'm giving any spoilers, I don't mean to, it's just there's quite a few parallels. They're both in the same sort of cyberpunk genre. But it's really interesting how they want to fuse together, and he said you can sort of come to like a higher level of existence and when we become one, where it really reminded me of in Evangelion with the Human Instrumentality Project, where the whole idea was to get everyone connected as sort of one being in a way that we sort of are within the web, but they wanted to take that even to a higher sort of plane, a higher level. And I think that's what they were trying to relate here. Whereas that was interesting, and you said it was necessary to sort of like, because we both died to sort of procreate for the next generation. Whereas in another series that we've talked about, which is Serial Experiments Lane, within that series, something that sort of contrasts that they talked about is when you're on the web, you sort of live forever, where you are kind of a god, where there's no real need, because even when you're gone, your sort of existence or what you put on the web is like there forever. And that way you sort of transcend sort of just being a being.
Yeah, I mean the evolutionary theory and Ghost in the Shell was interesting, right? Like the puppet master says, like, look, you know, we might not be able to reproduce, right? He's talking to the Major, right? but like, you know, DNA, you know, is, you know, one way of, you know, combining genetic code and passing it on, but like you can also fuse, you know, minds or ideas, right? And data, right? Like you said, you made a lot of great references, but it got me thinking about like, yeah, like we you know, as creatures of, you know, mammal creatures, we think of reproduction as only like, you know, the genetic code aspect of it, but like there could be the reproduction of information or, you know, or like I said, like the minds. Like we don't do mind fusions, but like in theory, right? Like if we're fusing two people's like bits, like bytes of, you know, mind information, and that becomes something new, that's technically evolution, right? Like even if it's bad or good, you know, it doesn't matter, right? It could be end up being, you know, being something that doesn't work, but you're still doing something that is trying to, you know, take a risk there, even though it's, you know, depending on what kind of risk. But yeah, it also got me thinking too. Okay, this is another Japanese thing. When he talked about, you know, minds fusing or information fusing, because that was, other than genes, that's what he led to. It reminded me of this great monologue in Metal Gear Solid 2, where the AIs say to the Raiden, who's one of the main characters. But by the way, if you didn't know that I consume a lot of Japanese media, that's your hint. There's a great famous interview you can watch on YouTube. It's called like the most profound moment in video game history, but which is a good video, but actually you should just watch the raw clip. But basically the villains tell the protagonist, you know, in this sea of information, there is no real evolution because there's no natural selection, where everybody's just outputting data, and then the only natural selection is like who is the most viral. And that this AI basically is there to curate and create context for history and for data and for information so that they know what's meaningful, what's not. And this was written, the script was written in 1999 or 2000. What's interesting now with the advent of like social media, fake news, and like blogs and stuff like that, is that we actually do have our own version of natural selection, which is probably not the one we want, right? Which is just the viral likes and dislikes and like, you know, who's getting the most retweets. But the same points is valid, right? Like we produce more information more YouTube videos even. I would just use YouTube as an example. We produce more YouTube videos every day than we did in previous history, because that's the exponential curve that, you know, data output is on. Not all data is meaningful. Like it could just be like 2-minute video of a cat or a 30-second video of like random lights. But it's still data, right? We're still pumping it out, uploading it, right? And what's interesting is it's true. Like it's the algorithms are determining kind of like based on people's viewing habits, like what gets trending, what doesn't get trending, what's just disappeared, right? So we have our own version of natural selection. I guess that is why I think society right now is at a little bit of an impasse, because now they're questioning, wait a second, like who owns these algorithms? Who's coding this? And should it be this way? But it's funny how like Kojima, and like I said, 20 years ago, you understood this and knew this was going to happen eventually. And I think also in the Ghost in the Shell, even though I think they're taking more of a bigger picture even of like human identity, human DNA, information. Even in that, you know, in that particular film, they're also questioning like how do we evolve when there's just so much, you know, data information? Like what is the next step of our evolution? Like this is, you know, like something is going to happen. We're going to figure out the hard way or the easy way, what it will be. But, you know, when I watch these kind of movies, it all just sort of blends and clicks together.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's just combines like so many things that are going on with our society, but sort of predicting what's, you know, coming next is pretty hard. But looking back, I guess in retrospect, it's always interesting to me seeing like a lot of these 90s era cyberpunk animations, you know, how they were really kind of able to predict a lot of what was going to go on within the internet age. I mean, you saw that specifically the one we talked about most recently was just Serial Experiments Lane, how a lot of things that they were sort of talking about, you're sort of inventing your own personality on the web. This is like came out right around the time when Google first started. A lot of these things sort of came true and was like, whoa, it's amazing like what they were really able to predict. And I know there was a lot of angst coming around with Y2K and how, you know, the computers were going to take over or whatever that controversy came, but no one really knew what was going to happen. It's amazing seeing how a lot of these sort of ideas came to fruition.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that like I haven't. There's actually a book I do want to read that's actually specifically about. It's like the ontology of cyberpunk. So like the thing about a lot of the philosophers of that period is that they're kind of like all over the place. Like some were radical feminists, but they were also cyberpunk, and then there were others that were like fascists, and they were cyberpunk, also Marxists, and like how this period,
libertarian,
libertarian, and how this period was like very specific, but like some like I think other philosophers have like long moved on, have like acknowledged that like this period and these writers were like very unique and actually probably wrote some of the more meaningful stuff that has impacted everyday life. Looking back, right? Like you said, it's always hindsight, right? Like at the time, it's funny how they write that like, oh, these people are just thinking science. Is it philosophy or is it science fiction? And then they look back now, they're like, oh, wait a second, yeah, identity, the internet culture, data consumption, data like output of like at an exponential rate. That like now they look back and like, wow, these people were crazy, but were they that crazy? Like it's interesting, right? Like you're saying, like it's like they get the benefit now in hindsight, but in the time, they were just like, what are you talking about? We're talking about Soviet Union, and we're talking about American capitalism, and I think these thinkers and also these artists were thinking of the world. What is the world after that? And that story is heavily on the internet, right? Whether you're in China, which is a different internet, Japan, or America, or Europe, that like that has been the story of Web 2.0. I call it Web 2.0, but it's the marketing of Facebook, Google Ads hitting its peak, and the what's the other example? YouTube, but yeah, the internet, and it's a whole other topic. But I think they didn't have the concept of the net. So you see that like it's funny how like the cord plugging, like you were saying, like the Matrix ripped off. It's almost like that's their version of like what they think the net is going to be. And I think that like it's obviously we're not plugging in, but I think the analogy is there though, right? Like how many people live only through their phones really now? Live through the social media image. I mean, we know so many people like that, but so in reality, if you say the phone is the plug, I would say the analogy is right there, like, it's pretty on point, which is actually pretty petrifying if you think about it.
It's a little terrifying, that's for sure.
Because some people only view their own existence and validation through that lens now, right?
Through what they put online,
yeah, or even their worldview is only what they read online. Like, oh, I read like they're coming after me, the radical whatever academia, and like they want to kill me all, like when you like, because remember feedback loops, right? If you only know those feedback loops, that's all you're gonna see. And I think, like I said, I think what Ghost in the Shell was trying to explore was like, okay, we know we have this like this paralysis. What's the next step, right? How do we get out of this, this cycle? And now it seems like the hint they seem to say is that we're gonna have to have this evolution ourselves, as human beings. But living now in the 2020 era, I'm still waiting. I'm still waiting for the next leap forward.
We'll see. Who knows? That next step may come in 50 years, or who knows how long. And then you could be like, oh, well, either they were completely wrong, or maybe they were totally right.
Well, I mean, I think if you're an optimist, you're hoping that they're right. But if you're a pessimist,
of course,
you're thinking, no, this is it, dude. The peak of history is the viral video of somebody, just dancing in a circle.
the latest Drake dance.
Yeah, but it's also why like it's so this guy was his name is Mark Fisher. I recommend reading. Anybody who wants to read his books, they should. It's very unfortunate that like I think he's an example of what happens when you reach these realizations way before anybody else's, because he was a part of that cyberpunk era philosopher, but he ended up committing suicide. It reminds me of David Foster Wallace, who probably saw the future and was like, I can't handle it, and unfortunately, the depression.
You can go way back from that. You can go to the 1800s with Nietzsche. Now he really predicted what was going to happen with, with communism and nihilism, and how that essentially led to sort of a lot of the communist takeovers.
Yeah, I mean,
Russia.
Yeah, I mean, you can go back all the way, especially the concept of the last man with Nietzsche, which is something that I love rereading. But just thinking of guys like Mark Fisher, where like they were at the cutting edge, and then they wrote great stuff, but then obviously the depression took hold, My point was more of like, if we don't, reach this higher level of like, evolution, like of our mutual understanding, knowledge, and all that stuff, that like in the end, what you have is basically like a feudalism, where the person who has the most likes is the most respected. The person who can be the most, outlandish is the one who gets all the eyeballs, where your attention is now drawn only to those things, and there's no, you're just, everything now is entertainment. Nothing is real. You're living almost like in a hyper realism.
It's a very sort of superficial reward system.
Yeah. It's like I said, it's hyper real, where everything is kind of like, is it real? Is it contextual? Like you don't really know anymore. And honestly, that can be overwhelming, because you're thinking like, oh my goodness, like, man, why am I even trying?
Like in today's, well, at least what you put on with like social media platforms, it's like it's just a filter, right? It's not really what you're experiencing in your day-to-day life. Just putting it over there to stunt, like I went to travel with Greece. You're like putting the best moments of your day-to-day lives on the net for everyone to see, right?
Exactly.
And that way, it's not reality. It's just a filtered perversion of that, if you will. And then you get rewarded for that, and you keep doing that by, all the likes or comments or whatever else, any sort of feedback loop.
Yeah, and something that, like, to go back to the film a little bit. So, like, obviously the puppet master is an artificial being. And what's interesting is that this was also a little bit before, this was like, when did, what's his name? The chess player lose, 98? So this is still years before the world chess player, the Russian one, lost to the IBM AI. And then this is still before IBM Watson, and then this is obviously before AlphaGo, which is revolutionary, right?
This is years before.
Yeah, and so I think back then, right, when it was outlandish to think of AI being like kind of autonomous. Now, obviously, they're not conscious yet, right? But obviously, when you see like the best world champion Go player lose to an AI that can now compute as many moves as there are atoms in the universe, you start like wondering, what is?
Well, I'll take you one up there. Recently, within the last 3 years, they had an AI program, I believe, out of Carnegie Mellon, that was able to, adapt and play Texas Hold'em poker, and because within chess you have it's a confined space with a certain number of rules, right? Where in Texas Hold'em the gameplay is a little different, where you can bluff, so you can try to fake like you have certain cards, and so you don't. When you're playing chess, right, everything is in front of you. You can calculate all the moves. Everything is visible. When you're playing Hold'em, you don't know what the other player's cards hold, right? So you can bluff, you can have them, and so there's a lot more that needs to go on in terms of calculating. But what was crazy, and you can talk to these poker players that were playing against this AI, I believe it like really beat them up pretty bad in the game. They're like, what was crazy is this AI knew how to fluctuate its play quite a bit in terms of going aggressive at times, holding back. It would like not. It would vary its moves when it would sort of bluff or not. So that's more like, whoa, that's beyond just mapping out every single move. That's like going and actually sort of refining your play to phenomena that are unknown. That's what was really impressive about that.
Yeah, I mean, I listened to a long 2-hour interview with David Silver, who worked on AlphaGo, and he says the promise of general artificial intelligence is to give it a problem that, like I said, imperfect information, and have it optimize and be perfect at creating optimal outcomes, right? And actually, he talked about how like AlphaGo, when they beat the Go world champion in Korea, it was actually a combination of obviously traditional machine learning and like how they went about with like studying the best players and having the AI mimic and beat the beat those players, as well as like having it self-learn. What they ended up doing was rebuilding the whole system. They call it Alpha Zero, where they just had it like, gave it the kind of like, I'm gonna use euphemism, not euphemism. I'm gonna use basic analogies here, where they just gave it like kind of like the pillars to do it, but they had it learn on its own how to learn Go and be really good at it. And by doing this, now these new AIs, they crush all the world champions 60-0. This is even better than the original version. And actually, so this unfortunately, this Lee Sedong, I think his name is, he actually ended up retiring because he gave a whole statement about how if even though he could beat every human in the world, he knows that there's someone that can beat him, which is kind of sad. But David Silver said that like it's sad because like he's always going to be remembered as the one guy that he did it once only, but defeated an AI at Go, because now he even admits that like they've taken another step higher, and like now even the world champions can't even keep up. And I think, I know we value heavily human intelligence and human intellect, and we think we're the image of the world, but it takes human achievement to do this. But it also puts into question, like, again, I think eventually some existential questions about like, okay, what's my value? Because if we're honest, right, we live in a current culture where the value is what you do, what work devotion is what I have heard it be termed. When you could talk to people, you often ask them what's your background, what's your ethnicity, but also what's your profession, what you study. And if we start like decoupling this from people, I think there's going to be some long-term effects on the society, because you're going to have a lot of people who are going to feel like, wait a second, like my grandfather was able to have a respectable career in GM, and now you're telling me that like the only thing I could do is just breathe. Like, it's going to be interesting the next like 20 years.
You're talking about like what's going to happen once AI starts replacing many jobs at a scary rate.
And it's already started, right? Like now, like if you look, here's the perfect example. Everybody talks about manufacturing jobs leaving the US, right? But if you look at charts of manufacturing productivity, it's actually higher now than it was when the peak of manufacturing jobs. We just do less. We just do more actually with less people. And again, I don't want to get into the environmental aspect of that, but I just wanted to, highlight that like we talk about moving all these factories from China or whatever, but honestly, those jobs aren't really coming back. Any of those factories moved to Mexico or whatever. Like they really know how to optimize. If they're building a new factory, they know how to optimize now for less workers, more productivity. So.
Yeah, and I mean, so you can wonder what's going to happen once you start stripping, what you can do away from your identity. But if you look at sort of what the current data is for people unemployed, it's not really good. Because I mean, this is more like political talk, but there's like really high, especially with like men in their 50s, suicide rates. There's like alcoholism and drug abuse is up within certain demographics as well. Specifically with the people who've been impacted by manufacturing. So based on sort of those observations, you know that sort of having like a job or like having that part of your identity is very crucial to like human well-being, I would say.
Yeah, and to go back to Ghost in the Shell, I think why this movie is still very relevant and timeless is because of those, like other than there's the puppet master stuff and there's like those existential questions, but that stuff about identity I think matters, and it's actually gonna get highlighted more
increasingly
because like I said, like we view identity as like very like if you look at most of our cultures and societies, it's very like basic, right? It's like who your parents were, how you grew up, and then like your job and stuff, and like. And obviously, it's becoming a little more fluid with like some modern research on like gender identity. But like in general, when that's attacked because these things are stripped away from you, we're already seeing some of the effects of how people are like confused, like when they don't have the job, or are they, like you said, like the major, like are they a boy and a girl? Like it creates a new conversation. And I think what's interesting about this film is that like you said, it's almost like visionary in the terms of like. These are actually going to be some of the big topics that are going to come up, because these topics of like wages are important, and they are because of our current, like I said, political era, and corruption and stuff. But like this other stuff that we're seeing now with like, work as a part of identity, what is, culture, what is, what is ethnicity, what's that impact on your identity, that is going to lead to some interesting conversations and uncomfortable conversations, because. Honestly, I don't think a lot of people have the answers, even though you have both sides of the spectrum saying like, I have the answers and they have the answers. I think a lot of people are going to get more and more confused because the traditional pillars of our society are corroding, not just because of like economics and globalism, but I think also like not to get too political, but what one politician, I'm going to say, not even say the name so I can stay discreet, was at least touching upon that like, if these things are taken away from us, like our college degree, because even college degrees, you could say is part of your identity, right? I went here, I learned this, I got, I went, this, I went to school in this area, right? When these start becoming less valuable and less like meaningful to make an identity, a lot of people are gonna have problems because we train people to, go up the ladder because you've done X, Y, Z, right? And that's gonna again lead to a lot of interesting political or even societal tension and turmoil because we don't even talk about this in public, right? We don't go on TV, and I don't see any mainstream person say, like, we need to rethink like our value system, like it can't just be how much money you have, or what I do is more meaningful than what you do, like because in the end we're all going to be the same boat. In the end, honestly, my philosophy is that in the end we're all going to be like, AI is just going to code better than me, and there you go, I'm out of job too. So
Yeah, I mean, you sort of spoke about a lot within that sequence. But what I will say, and I do agree with you, is that this film really touched upon, what sort of constitutes one's identity way back, like several decades before this is really sort of like a conversation that's we're really having in the public sphere, like more increasingly so, I would say. Yeah, within the concept of identity, like traditionally it was, like you were saying, where'd you go to school? Where are your parents from? And what do you do? So those are things. I would say like identity is important no matter like what culture you go into. It's just like our sort of criteria for what are the important factors that will form your identity, they're sort of changing. I think they will continue to do so from here forward. I don't see them like getting that conversation becoming more simplified, right? I think we're just living in a more complex world, so these questions are going to become increasingly more complex. But yeah, so I think that this was a really interesting movie because it spoke about a lot of these issues way before, way before like they started becoming very mainstream in the public sphere. But yeah, I mean, you spoke about a lot. We can touch upon that a lot of point, but that was like more sort of a political tangent that I don't know if we need to unpack anymore.
No, that's fine. Yeah, it's just that this is like, so every film, so in general, we've talked about this amount of films. It's interesting how like some films are targeted, right? We can talk about New York City, like the Do the Right Thing, right? Like race and stuff. While this one, it feels like it's like
it's broad.
We're almost talking about, we talk about the movie, but it's really a platform. And this is why I think Oshii is good at, and I think this is why he likes these kind of films. Because all his other films, if you watch a few more, they're actually similar. You end up talking about you'll talk about the movie, and then you'll start deviating, because I think that's what he wants you to do. You start talking about like the bigger questions that the movie's posing to you, and I think that is part of art, right? Like this is why I consider anime or film art, because you end up like with good movies, not like bad ones. And like I said, there's ones that I enjoy, like Clerks. I enjoy that, but I'm not asking myself existential questions, right? After that movie, right? But I think this movie, like it's like, I think in general it's supposed to do that. I think it's supposed to get you asking like these questions, because these kind of questions, they definitely, you can apply to what you're seeing and what you're reading or what you're feeling in the world today. I was just gonna ask, like, what were your, like, I mean, I can give my final thoughts about the movie, but to wrap up a little bit. But yeah, I mean, this movie, I ironically enough, I'm not like, I talk highly about this movie, but I wouldn't consider it a 10 out of 10. But it's one of those movies that like I look back and I'm like, yes, I watched this movie and definitely my life changed. Like, how sometimes you just watch a movie and you're like, I didn't watch that, that was bad, But this movie, like I do genuinely remember like those specific 3 scenes, right? I mean the fight scene too, but like the memory, the puppet master monologue as he's captured at the end too. It's just every now and then when I'm reading sci-fi or I'm reading something about technology, it just creeps in somehow, because it's like, wow, like this is we're gonna open the jar here. Let's see what's in it.
The can of worms.
So I mean, and I'm a big Oshii fan, if you didn't catch that. But yeah, I mean, to me, this movie is like definitely like a solid like 9 out of 10. I personally have had my philosophy changed, I know, by this film. So and got me to reading more of the cypherpunk and some of the stuff. I didn't cite their names, but I've definitely read a lot in this field. Go ahead.
So before I go into sort of what my rating is, where does this? Because you watch far more anime than I do. Where does this rank on your anime list?
I have to check my list, but I know it's in my top 10.
Is it top 10?
It's definitely top 10. Even though I know that Lane definitely moved in my top 3. So
Yeah, so I would probably second your sort of rating. I'd give it a 9 out of 10. I thought it was really good and posed some really interesting existential questions. I like sort of the style that Oshii made this film. And in terms of like the sort of setting and the characters, I had heard that apparently in the manga that sort of inspired this film, Ghost in the Shell, back in '89, that Kusanagi's character was actually more feminine and female in the traditional sense, but he sort of wanted to stray away as well as younger. And so he wanted to change sort of the role or how he wanted to portray her within this film to make it seem like she was sort of, I wouldn't say less feminine, just like less feminine, I guess, in the traditional sense, and make it so that, she had a lot more existential questioning. Yeah, I would definitely give it a 9 out of 10. I like sort of the style and direction he went with it. Where it sort of faltered is you sort of just get, I felt like you just get, I know this is very complex and you just kind of, I just felt like you were kind of thrown into this sort of universe rather abruptly. I wish, and this film was fairly short. I think he could have expanded it another 20 minutes just to introduce it a little bit better. And I think I would have liked that more.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I agree with you. It's a tad short, but honestly, like we've been covering some longer films, so I found it a bit refreshing. But
yeah.
To your point, yes, because I've watched the anime. I haven't read the manga, but I watched this TV series, and it's honestly it's a bit jolting if you're like you're a big fan and you watch the show, because it's like because the series is a little more, like you said, like I don't want to say closer to the manga, but like because they also just took inspiration. But yeah, that Kusanagi is like more feminine and like you said, a bit younger. While this one, like it's more ambiguous. Like you can almost argue
ambiguous.
They're different like Kusanagis because like they're not related because they're made by different creators. Also, shout out for Production IG that made this version of the film. So they deserve credit. Especially the live action was trash.
You didn't see the live action though.
I know, but it's gonna be garbage. I'm not, I just throw garbage in my mind. I pretend it never happened. But no, I think you're on point where the length and with what I will say about like sci-fi in general is that that's the hardest part about sci-fi is the beginning, because if you think about it, like it's very very few times I've seen it done almost perfectly where like you're new to the world and yet it's just explained to you, not through like big exposition, but like through just the storytelling.
Yeah. So I will agree with you because I compare this film to like other cyberpunk media that I've seen within anime, but pretty much most of the cyberpunk that I've consumed has been in the form of shows. So you have like more time to introduce things.
Yeah.
So I'll give it credit for that.
It's hard in the movie. I do agree that like 9 is fair, but like I've just noticed that like even in like let's say like let's do like live action, it's still the toughest aspect there because it's like okay, you're injected and it's like maybe they do a little like like screen roll, like even Star Wars did this, right? Oh, here's a screen roll, like that's not cyberpunk, but I mean sci-fi in general has that difficulty.
I guess I felt like that when it's been a while since you've seen The Matrix. I felt like they did a pretty good job sort of introducing. You weren't thrown in.
The Matrix is probably like one of the best examples of good.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's hard in general. It's like The Matrix is probably the poster child when it comes to like introducing it and making it part of the story.
Good way, yeah.
And just get you immersed in the world. And by the time you're in the third one, you're like, yeah, I know all the mechanics. Let me see the ending, But it's the hardest part about sci-fi in general, or fantasy too. It's the world mechanics in the beginning, because unless you have a lot of time, like a book, it's hard to explain all that, right? Like especially in a movie that's like 90 minutes. But yeah, I think it's totally fair.
One little tidbit, I don't know if you know this, but you might find it interesting. When the first scene when you're actually trying, or you see the puppet master for the first time, and you had the American sort of coder going in and sort of looking into the ghost to see if it's actually indeed their project that they're looking for. So you notice like a lot of the little code that's sort of on screen gets brought up in sort of green letters. That was actually in the correct syntax. That's actually C code. I don't know if you actually knew that or not, but it was actually done properly.
Interesting.
Which I thought was like, I was like, wow, okay, the detail.
I saw the code and I've written C, but I actually did not. I'm not gonna go and look at that clip again. I'm curious to see like how complicated that C code was because
I don't know, and I don't know what it executes, but I just thought that was an interesting little tidbit.
I'm actually gonna like take a look now. I'll let you know later after the podcast what there was writing, but I know that some shows like Mr. Robot has done like that when he writes those unit commands, those actually exist. But I've also seen the worst where it's like there's just random things. I'm like, okay,
it's gibberish.
Yeah, it's just gibberish. So,
but I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
I feel like when you're more true to the details, oftentimes the art turns out to be better.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, I think, I think we do a lot of hammering of like mainstream movies and TV shows. And, but I think, unfortunately, I think a lot of it is like regurgitated. And, they gloss over details or interesting stories because they just want to get, they want to make money, right? And what sells money is the biggest net, right? Like, I think we've seen this definitely in the last 10 years where like, we have to, it's like you can, when I watch a movie now that's a blockbuster, I can already tell in the first 20 minutes that like they had a meeting that said, how do we make this the most appealing to everybody? Whether you're a woman, you're African-American, you're Mexican, how do we make a movie that's appealing to everybody? And I guess there's a place for that because those are money makers, some are blockbusters, but I think what's going on is that we're losing, like people aren't as interested like as much into the niche, like a story that maybe takes effort on our part because we're not like, I'm not Korean, maybe I got to learn about Korean culture, a film about like, about that maybe culture, society, and like that storyline. But I also think that there's some things that are universal, like this movie, like specifically, I think there were themes there that are very universal. I think that's why it's a great film and why it had a wide appeal. But like, I think in general, we're losing that like, that appetite to like, watch a Peruvian film. I'm not saying we're gonna do one, but and having to do some effort on our part to like understand like what is this artist trying to portray, right? Because often the art is personal, So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I know we've hit this point, but the fact that you're talking about how universal this film really is, and I would agree with that. I mean, to sort of show to what extent it is universal. I mean, this was the inspiration for The Matrix, so we can relate to this within our own culture because it ended up spinning off what is considered probably one of the best science fiction films, arguably like ever made here.
There's going to be a fourth one too because that's how our culture is now. We need to regurgitate.
Honestly, I stopped watching after the first one.
What's interesting is that, so there's a YouTuber that covered this. So the second one and third one, you could tell that I forgot their names, but the two creators, they went really like too heavy on the philosophy. So the first one is perfect because it has a bit of the pop philosophy, I'll call it, with a great structure story, right? And maybe I'll send this to you after we do the podcast. But there's a video of a guy that he actually admits he was like you, like I hated the second and third one. But then once I read some philosophy,
I don't hate it. I just haven't seen it because at my point I've seen. Go ahead.
I'll send you this video because what he says is that like he didn't like the movies, but once I think he studied philosophy in college. I forgot, or if not in college, he did it on a personal like hobby. He said once he like read a lot more and then rewatched those films, then he was like, oh, I get it now. I see that these were the topics I was trying to explore. But unless you read philosophy, you're not going to like these movies because the first one was such a good, story, like beginning to end with little tidbits of knowledge. But the other two are kind of they feel disjointed. He goes into that. It's not too long of a video, but I was like, I remember watching that going like, that's why I like these movies because I've read some of these thinkers, because I was always like, The Matrix 3 isn't that bad. It's actually not as good as the first one, but it's watchable. But people are like, think it's trash. And I think this says a lot about our culture where like, our society where like it's all.
When it gets too philosophical, it gets a little.
It has to be spoon-fed, yeah.
It gets a little too hard to digest. I mean, it's like, I know I've mentioned this several times because this is personally probably my favorite anime I've seen, but with Serial Experiments Lane, it was just like they went super heavy into a lot of the existential philosophy and themes, but it was like, it seemed disjointed at times, but it was just so mind-blowing at the end where you're like, wow, that was worth it. And I feel like a lot of people wouldn't necessarily feel the same way. I know. Speaking on like the Matrix 2 and 3, I just haven't seen them. I'm just under the, maybe I should go watch them. I'm just under the impression oftentimes when I've seen sort of, sequels or trilogies, oftentimes the second and third movies tend to be trash. That's just my bias of seeing things as, like when they make like the second or third movies, they often tend to be just like recycled themes and whatever. But maybe I'm just not giving the Matrix trilogy.
Well, I'll send you the clip and then you can make your own determination. But even though there'll probably be some spoilers in there, but actually the movies aren't as good as the first one. I think as a purist, like if you're talking about storytelling, storyboard is not as good. But I see what the YouTuber was saying, that he was explaining that basically they knew that, to your point about like sequels, they knew that if they just did what they did before, it's going to seem like every other sequel. So they try to they try to take risks, even though it didn't work out like in the box office. But by doing that, he actually admits that like now that he's read more philosophy, like, oh, I actually like these movies now. So that's, I'm going to send you the clip anyways, but I think you'll find that interesting because I think that's what happens a lot, right? With the sequel. Oh, it's the same as the other one. Or they did a different twist and it's like, wait.
Dude, it's like the Godfather series, same thing.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect. Yeah, exactly. It's like the first one's so good, like, why am I watching the third one? But the problem with sequels that when you take those risks, they either hit them out of the park, like Empire Strikes Back, or it's bad.
Or the other one was like the Jurassic Park sequels. It's like after the first one, kind of like.
Oh, that's so true. I mean, the fourth one was like terrible, but yeah,
they're all pretty bad. The one exception I will say is I actually really enjoyed Terminator 2.
Well, that's what I mean. Like so good sequels. That's what I've noticed, that like they take a concept, they treat the viewer as like they saw the first one and they have the same world structure, but they do something that's new. That's what the risk is. It's always the new thing, right? It's either it's going to work and you're going to have a great sequel, like I said, Terminator 2, Empire Strikes Back, or you're going to blow it up and it's going to look like, what were you thinking,
Right.
So I think to your point, that's why I think they play it safe so much now, because now it's a money thing, right? So they got to make sure the sequel does sell. So
sure. I mean, look how many Marvel movies they make. Let me just input new character or have them all together and make a blockbuster bang.
Here's I'll give Marvel a ton of credit. What they've mastered somehow, and I think that's what everybody else is struggling to master, is that they somehow master the sequel with the illusion that they're doing a twist, but really it's not really a twist. It's not really different.
It's not a twist.
Yeah, but people, like, you've seen the analysis. People do think it's like, oh, look at this the radical difference it took in the first one. Is I know, because we agree here, it's not really. But they've magically mastered the whole facade there. And I think
they know how to make it seem as if there's a twist. And that's, I mean, I will give them credit. They know how to keep people engaged. They know it. And it shows by their blockbuster type numbers where they make insane revenue.
Yeah, I mean, Marvel, that's why I'll give them credit, because they somehow they've done what every other studio dreamed of doing, right? Like they've created basically a cinematic universe that is somehow novel, but not really novel now at this point, and yet they keep making the money. Warner Brothers wanted to do this with this, and other studios have wanted to, like James Bond, they've tried to do this forever, and now even people are getting tired of that. So,
DC Comics wanted to try to do this, but they rushed it because they're another. They rushed it, and it was just not executed right. Aside from, I mean, these are some of my favorite superhero movies of all time, but we're like the Dark Knight series.
Oh, yeah, that's so good, dude. I love those movies.
I'm just gonna sound like a Marvel hater, but I've seen a lot of Marvel films. None of them quite match up to the even the storyline or the level of depth that that Dark Knight series went to under Christopher Nolan. To me.
I mean, Christopher Nolan's a very special director, so I mean, it's a high standard.
But that being said, I did really like Iron Man. I love the first one.
That was a good one. I mean, that's what started it all, right? Yeah. And even ignoring Marvel, there's also other IPs that are like this, right? Like they're redoing the Lion King and
and all these live action remakes. I'm like, come on.
They want to just make money.
Dude, as far as I'm concerned, they're lacking creativity when you have to go and rip off something in that way.
Well, I think that it's the reason that I think they're doing that is because there's risk in having creative ideas, right? We've done a lot of movies now where the story is, oh, I struggle to get money because nobody want to take a risk on me, right?
Yeah.
Most people don't want to take risks. They're like, okay, do we do this thing, or do I go with like, oh wait, this is gonna sell 100 million? Yeah, let's do that. I don't care if it's like the same caricatures, you know. So I think in general, that's in that creative industry. I think that's the difficulty is you're taking a swing. You're either gonna hit it and it's gonna be decent, or it's gonna miss, and it's just gonna be one of those movies that are like, wow, we just lost money. And now film business is it's like any other corporation. It's it's all about the bottom line.
Yep. Well, I mean, we'll wrap up pretty quick, but I mean, a lot of these films are filmed by private investors. You don't want to just give your money to a studio and have it potentially be a flop.
Exactly.
So you want to get your return back. Anyway, I think we should wrap up. Do you have any final thoughts?
No final thoughts. I was just going to say, like, this is episode 10. It's an extra long one, but it fits because, I mean, 10 is a milestone. I think in, like, any podcasting, it's like 10, 25, 50, and then it's like 100. You know, 10 is, like, a big deal. So this was a good episode, too, so I enjoyed our conversation. So I'll let you take the floor then.
Yeah, anyway, I think we don't have any more final thoughts. So if you enjoyed our commentary on this episode, our 10th episode, reviewing Ghost in the Shell, then please like and subscribe. And we'll see you next week with our next review. I believe we're going to be reviewing To Kill a Messenger. It's a film by Jeremy Renner. So
yeah, I was going to ask if you were still doing that one, but yeah.
Yes, we are.
I'm so excited to watch that.
So Kill a Messenger by Jeremy Renner. It's a 2014 film. I believe that might be our most recent, in terms of date, film, the film that's been made to date. So anyway, we'll see you next week. You take care. Bye.